G'day everyone, I'm Caitlin and I'm from Australia. Woo! Thank you for cheering. I took a very long flight to get here, so I deserved that. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker to you all, but before I do that, I'm just going to really briefly talk a bit about Personal Project in Australia. We have been running Personal Project in Sydney for the last 2 years. The first year I was involved just as a participant, and this year I and Rachel helped to run it. And it's been really great. We've had about 70 people each year. We've had to actually sort of knock people back, which is very exciting. For us, not for them. And it's been really successful. It's been successful depending on how you term success. Because we all know that Personal Project is not a singles event, and it's not a dating experience, except that it totally is. People come and they're like, I'm not here to find someone. I was just looking, that wasn't. And so people ask us all the time. We were talking to someone from Nigeria, I think. They were telling us about Personal Project in Nigeria and saying, we have had 4 million marriages come out of Personal Project. Everyone got married. They all met each other, and then the next year, there were 25,000 weddings. Everyone got married. And we're like, and they're like, what about you? Did you have any relationships? Anyone get together? Any marriages? And we were like, no. But we did have one breakup. And we were really proud of it. It was great because this couple had come along and the session was all about commitment. So they're sitting in a small session talking about commitment. This guy's a commitment phobe. He's not committing to his girlfriend. It's really bad. And then later, the two of them go out for dinner, and the girlfriend's like over her pasta. She's like, anyway, so speaking of commitment, how committed are you, to this? And he's like, not very. Anyway, so he stopped coming. But she kept coming and kept looking. But we considered that a great success because ultimately the point of it is, that we're getting people to think more deeply. And we were like, you're welcome. We have saved you from having that conversation in 5 years. So our next speaker is another Australian. His name is Andy Mullins. I'm going to pull up his bio because it's long. Andy Mullins is an adjunct associate professor of the University of Notre Dame in Australia, which is in Sydney. He's also the director of Drummond Study Centre in Victoria. He's had heaps of experience in education with young people. He was the headmaster of Redfield and Wallamai colleges, which are schools in Sydney, which are run by the Parents for Education Foundation, PARED. He has published a book called Parenting for Character, Equipping Your Child for Life. And the Spanish title, here we go, is El carácter de tu hijo. Yo hablo español. Anyway, thank you very much. Please welcome Andy.
It's fantastic. Caitlin, thanks very much. Hey, great to be here. Thanks for the welcome. I feel like I've got here and protests have been following me. I was walking through, Luke, one of the guys here, was with me, and we were walking through Barcelona 2 nights ago, and we walked into the street where the big blaze was, and we had a bit of a sticky beak, and now there's more protests, so I'm concerned. But it is good to see that. I think there are 1 million people trying to get into this conference and they can't get here. They're just outside. Is that right? I think so. Okay, let's jump into this. First off, let me think. I've got some cheat notes. Okay, first off, now, background checks. Who am I? The 2 schools that I've been involved in, that was really a highlight for me professionally. Wonderful schools. Whoa, come back. Wonderful schools in Sydney. Redfield, you can see down the bottom right, and Wallamai in the middle. But really the big influence on me and on what I've been doing is St. Josemaria. And I want you to look really carefully at that slide. And about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom, can you see the guy in the blue hat? The guy in the blue hat, that was at the canonisation. It was fantastic. That was me. And now I'm involved in a school in Melbourne called Harkaway Hills College, which is a brand new project of 3 young couples. And if these 3 young couples had not rolled up their sleeves and created this school, nothing would have happened. The board in Sydney of the Parents for Education Foundation said, we can't do it, we're stretched, we have too much to do in Sydney. So these 3 young couples basically said, we're going to do this, and they did it. And much of what I'm going to say here now is about applying yourself with courage to goals that are really important. And I think you're going to, that, to me, that's a wonderful example, because already there are 80 young people benefiting from that school, and next year there'll be 120, and it'll grow like that. I wrote that book, Parenting for Character, but I also did a doctorate on what happens in our brains when we build virtue, because we're embodied creatures. So it's really important that we understand that the actions that we carry out change us. And if we do the wrong actions, those things can change us dramatically and change us, in a sense, permanently. They talk about how every action changes our brain, for better or for worse. Okay, here we go. Today's plan. 2 places in Victoria where I live at the moment, Ballarat and St Kilda. We'll talk about it. But we're going to talk about a number of key features which will end up, I think, challenging you, looking at some wonderful case studies. So I hope I can fit all this in. What's that? That's branding. Can you think of who's the most interesting person you've ever sat next to on a plane? I was catching a plane up to Sydney the other day, and I was sitting next to a guy, and I introduced myself, and he said, "Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a body piercer, and I come from Ballarat, and I've just opened my body piercing clinic in Ballarat." I said, "Whoa." And then he was quite enthusiastic about his work. He said, "I do piercings, but I do brandings as well." And he showed me a picture of a branding which was 2 wrists, and one of them was tattooed and the other was branded, like cuts. And I'm thinking, whoa, how can I turn this conversation into something constructive? So I said, "You must get a lot of people coming in to see you who are quite troubled and need assistance." And then he said, "Oh yes, no, I get really messed up people coming to see me, and they want tattoos and they want all sorts of strange things." And I said, "What do you do?" And he says, "I try to talk to them, I try to help them." I went, whoa. This guy had metal in his face all over, and he had, anyway, I won't say what else, but it's amazing, right? Everybody has this desire to help people big time. I have in my family, I have a relative who has had a really tough time with drugs and with boyfriends who've abused her, and a real mess. I was talking to her once and she just said, "I just want to go to a developing country and help people. That's all I want to do." It's amazing, isn't it? There's a book that's come out of the States last year called The Character Gap, and it's written by a guy called Christian Miller, who's a sort of philosopher. But the whole question in the book is, why is really well-developed character with obvious virtues, why is that different to where we are? Why is this big gap between people who are really virtuous and ourselves? So we have good desires, but we don't deliver sometimes. Why is that? And I hope this next half hour or 3/4 of an hour will give us some insights into that. It comes down very much, doesn't it, to, in a sense, where we're seeking happiness. And you can say we can look for happiness in things, which is pretty basic, or in a bargain, or in being noticed, or in having a loyal pet. Do you know how loyal that pet is? Do you know what it's doing? It's on the back of a guy in a wingsuit. That's how brave that pet is. Or in party tricks. I wonder if there's any way we can get some of the lights off the front here. Is there any possibility, I wonder? Or is it being able to sleep at work? I was talking to a friend of mine who, I went to his wedding, and then his father was talking to me. He's a delightful Indian doctor from Singapore. And he was telling me, look, essentially all of our problems come back to the 3 Ps. I'm thinking, whoa, what are the 3 Ps? The 3 Ps: possessions, pleasure, and power. I'm thinking, oh, okay. If we let our impulses for these things get the better of our reason, then in the end, it's not good for us, obviously. Pleasure and power, pleasure can be good for us, but if it's against reason, it's not very good. But then it's not just the 3 Ps, is it? Because we realise we go too far. We end up doing stuff that really, really embarrasses us. We really let ourselves down at times. So our desires take their revenge on us in some way. Or how is it possible that we can take enjoyment from stuff that's so even virtually violent? They say that 45% of computer games are violent. And they talk about the 3 effects of violence in computer games. The first effect is that we're desensitised to violence and that we're more aggressive in the short term. But the third effect is quite interesting. The third effect is that we are a little bit paranoid. So when you and I walk down the street, if we've been playing computer games, our feeling threatened is actually heightened and we start to distrust people. Isn't that interesting? So we've got to be a bit cautious. And we can do stuff which is obviously, in the end, right out on the fringe and may or may not be good for us. And in the end, maybe some of these things are an expression of just being self-centred. They say that of all of the some ridiculous proportion of photographs in the world that are taken that are selfies, right? But then a ridiculous proportion of the selfies that are taken are then enhanced to look better. Get it? What's going on? This was actually a big dance party near where my last school was. One of the guys at this died, and one of the guys who was attending the dance party at the Sydney Regatta Park, the big grounds where they had the rowing for the Olympics a few years ago, he died from an overdose. And since then, maybe 7 or 8 people have died from overdoses at these dance parties across New South Wales. But what's the message of the stage? It's interesting, isn't it, how we're just this subliminal stuff is getting pumped into us all the time. And we just accept it with everything else. I sat next to some people, again on a plane, who were going to this party the next year. And I said, I'm sorry, I tried to put you guys out of business, but it didn't work. Or is it in having the numbers? Is that where happiness lies? Simply being popular? Have you seen the movie Hitchhiker's Guide? It's an old movie now. But it's, in the end, it says, it's cynical. It says that, what's the secret of happiness? The secret of happiness is 42. Why 42? It's a mystery. It's a problem, isn't it? That we all want to be happy, but we don't know how to be happy. And in the end, we can take a cynical attitude towards anybody who seems to have the truth. We've got this great capacity as human beings to be rational, to seek out the truth, to understand the truth, to grasp it and make decisions based on it. But when people claim to have the truth, we can be a little bit cynical, all of us. So this is sort of the first punctuation point in what I wanted to say to you, that if we want to know what makes us happy, we have to know what a human being is first. There was a really famous philosopher here in England, Elizabeth Anscombe, who said in 1958, we should stop doing moral philosophy until we get our psychology right. Until we know what a human being is, how can we talk about moral philosophy? Yet there's a lot of people making their livings on moral philosophy at the moment, and they don't really have much of an idea, or they don't certainly agree about what a person is, what a human being is. Okay, so the next part of the session, I've got a friend who says that her 2 children are like animals. One is a cat, one is a dog. The cat only comes home at feeding time, but the dog follows her everywhere. So are human beings just cats in disguise? Think about it. Animals can have amazing willpower, right? You can train animals just as you can train a young child, and sometimes more successfully. It's not just the dogs. Look at the cat. What willpower. So, and we know enough about the way we work that we can set up good habits. We can set up conditionings in our behaviour. We know what the pathways are in our brains for this. So are we just sort of biological mechanisms? Is that the most we can say about human beings? Because unless we know what a human being is, we won't know what makes us happy. If we think that a human being is just living in the world of the senses, then we will satisfy a human being by pouring pleasure into their senses. Human beings are not cats. Cats only know what their senses tell them. Cats can't override their emotions, but we can override our emotions, can't we? If we feel really cranky and upset and impatient, we can actually dominate that and put a smile on our face. Do you know the silly experiment that they did? If you're really having a bad day, you wake up in the morning, you feel horrible, you feel glum, and out of a matter of interest, you do a mood survey and you realise I'm only a 4 out of 10 today. That's not good. So what do? You get a biro, you get a pen, and you put it in your mouth, and you form a smile, and you walk around the house for half an hour with the biro in your mouth, with a smile on your face. Do you know what happens? You do the mood survey again, and you get a 6 or a 7. Isn't that crazy? Just by forming a smile, you actually feel better. There's a lot in this. We can override our emotions when we make choices to override our emotions. But if we let our emotions run our lives, then we have a problem. And cats can't live for anybody else. Sort of obvious, isn't it? And no matter how clever your cat is, no matter how good your cat is with an iPhone, cats can't override their conditionings. In the end, if your cat's hungry and it's feeding time, the cat comes. Cats can't sacrifice themselves for a better reason. Cats can't even do silly things. Who would do that? No self-respecting cat would do that. And cats can't set goals. Do you know who this guy is? This is Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a famous psychiatrist who was already a famous psychiatrist in the 1930s. And then he was Jewish, and he was put into a concentration camp by Hitler. And he used that experience to further refine his psychiatric theories. And he observed the people around him in the concentration camp, and he realised those who had meaning in their lives had better survival rates. But the people who gave up, who surrendered to negativity, those people were the ones who died first. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, right? But look at that quote from the top there. He says that we can either be run by impulses, by our drives, or we can set goals for ourselves. And, down the track, when you guys have got little guys around your ankles, and you're thinking, what are the most important things I need to do so that I raise these kids to take control of their lives? Give your kids plenty of practice in setting goals for themselves, and then encourage them to set goals that are really noble. Because, you look around your friends, and I look around my friends when they were younger, right? And you realise a lot of people they're a bit aimless. They don't really work with specific goals. So really, and I see in the personal project course outlines, the idea of becoming a person who sets goals is really important. And then we throw ourselves into those goals. And of course, it's not just goals, because you can have goals for the 3 Ps, can't you? You can have goals to be the most powerful person in the world, or You can have goals to have a Porsche or a Lamborghini or whatever, right? Possessions. It's what goals you then set for yourselves that matter. And of course, the most important goals that we need to set are goals that will enable us truly to love others. I'm stating the obvious. We all know this, but we have to defend this with our friends as well. Because if we're not convinced about this, we will go for the 3 Ps. We will be suckers for the 3 Ps. And I've taught a lot of people now, and I've tracked a lot of the ex-students of the schools that I've been at, and I know that some guys just fall into the trap of going after the 3 Ps. And why is that? It's not because of any specific thing, but somewhere along the line their education was a little bit defective, and then they gave into it. You know, ultimately we're made to love, but we have to know what's good for us. We have to make the right choices. Let me throw this at you. What's that? That's the Shema. The Shema is the line out of the book of Deuteronomy, and this is a truth about human beings. This is not a religious truth that I'm going to tell you. It's a truth about human beings. But in the Shema is the text from the book of Deuteronomy that says, "Love the Lord your God with your whole heart and soul and mind and strength," right? And then it says, and make sure that you talk about this to your children. Make sure that you put it up as decorations in your home. Even wear it on your clothing. Wear it wrapped around your forehead, that you've got to love God above everything. Do you know what comes next? What comes next is Moses explains that because when you are in the land of milk and honey, you will be tempted to forget this. And we're in the land of milk and honey. Milk is all of the stuff we need. Honey is all of the good bits. Is this making sense? And if life gets too easy, and if we get too attracted to the honey, and if we get too comfortable with all of the stuff that, you know, makes life comfortable, we will forget that man is made for loving God and loving others. And we fall into that trap. Why have we got this rise in atheism now? Why have we got this rise in divorce rates? Because we've become so comfortable that we've become very selfish. And we've forgotten that the only thing that makes us happy as human beings is love. And love always means sacrifice. In fact, the proof of love is sacrifice. Otherwise, it's just an impulse. We have our milk and honey, don't we? Makes you think. One of the students, one of the dads, one of the guys that I've taught his boy at Redfield, he said whenever his son complains, he pulls out the complaints book. And the complaints book on one side has that picture, and on the other side it has the poor little kids who are starving. And then the boy stops complaining. Another family that I taught, their son was, when he was tiny, when he was young, he used to complain he didn't have enough toys. So his parents took him, they were Indian background, and they took him to one of Mother Teresa's orphanages. And the boy walks with his parents through Mother Teresa's orphanage, and he realises there's no toys here. So then he says to the nun, "Where are all the toys?" And the nun says, "We used to give them toys and they would fight. Now we play music and they dance." Makes you think. So what have we got to do? We've got to keep reminding ourselves that our house has 4 pillars. And we need to make sure that the 4 pillars of our house are very strong. If we are to love successfully, we need to make sure that we can choose our pleasures wisely, that we can accept difficulties for a good reason, that we can go through life looking at other people, not looking at ourselves. We've got it, and that's the virtue of justice, that we don't make a decision without how does this affect other people. And the last one is that we live in reality, and our goals are based on reality. They're not based on something that is whimsical. If we have the 4 cardinal virtues acquired in our character, there will be no character gap. That's the issue. And to acquire virtues, as Aristotle said, is arduous. It doesn't come wanting to have virtues, because virtues are acquired by repetition. So if we want to acquire the virtue of temperance or self-control, we have to constantly try to get better at exercising self-control. And what's self-control? Self-control is managing where our attention goes. That we don't just let our attention always go to stuff that distracts us or gives us pleasure at the wrong time, getting distracted from our studies or whatever. And if we want to have fortitude, I'm going to talk about some really tough examples of fortitude in a few minutes. But most of the daily fortitude that we have to encounter is to put up with the discomfort of doing something on time when we decided we were going to do it. Interesting. We don't know all about, but we know a little bit now about how we manage our emotional responses and how we can act on impulse, or we can process the emotional response that is being triggered in our brain. Emotions are a good thing in themselves. They're a way of interacting with the world, but our emotions can't then control our lives. We even know that there's areas of the brain that connect. There's pathways of the brain. And some of you guys who are doctors will know much more about this than I do. But we know the pathways of the brain that connect the emotional centres of the brain with the prefrontal cortex, which is where we can better process things, where we can make, with our freedom, we can make choices. And we also know how we can form intentional habits. So this is all about being embodied. Being virtuous is not being just wanting to have virtues. Being virtuous is developing the pathways of behaviour by repeated actions. And the more we do something, the easier it gets. And not only that, the more we do something, the more we actually will like it. It will start to release reward processes that support that behaviour in the brain. But it starts with a choice. We know that man is made to love, right? We know that from psychology, if we've got a sound psychology. Look at that beautiful quote from John Paul. Man cannot live without love. He remains incomprehensible for himself without it. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him. If he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own. So this is about us, right? I mean, this is us. If we don't discover love in our lives, we will be really, really snookered. This is big. You know, Caitlin jokes about, discovering the right person, right? But it's really, it's a very important part of your life. That when you give yourself in love to somebody, you give yourself with your whole heart and soul and strength. And strength means everything you got. I went to the wedding of some friends of mine years ago, and the priest said to them, loving each other means giving until you don't know if there's going to be anything left for yourself. That's how much you've got to love each other. So, again, I'm talking about the Garden of Eden, but this is a truth about human beings. Do you remember what were two of the commands given to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and till the garden. This is before the fall. This is before they made big mistakes, right? Be fruitful and till the garden. There's something profoundly truthful about this, about our character. That the two of the major ways, and for many people, the two major ways that we learn to live for others is in family or in our work. And we have to make sure that in family and in work, we are truly living for others. We're not living for ourselves. And this is a very natural process, isn't it? That everybody works, everybody has some sort of family. And in this really natural environment, we learn to live for others. But we can torpedo that process. How do you torpedo it? In work, you torpedo the idea of work as service if work as making myself richer, having more possessions takes over? How do you torpedo family as a path to living for others if you torpedo marriage and if you torpedo the very concept of what a human being is, what a man and a woman is? If you muddy the waters about what a man and a woman is, then marriage becomes impossible. And this is what we're seeing in our society today. We're seeing that work has become greed. And we've seen that marriage has been distorted and twisted, and human sexuality has been twisted. So the two sort of so natural, obvious ways that we should learn to live for others are being taken away from us, and we have to fight that. Is that making sense? I think it's really important that we don't give ground on this. I won't waste time on these next two slides, but love becomes self-indulgent if we change the nature of marriage. And work very easily becomes self-serving once we start focusing on the money involved. Work is service first of all. And volunteering our assistance and time and help for others, that's not some nice extra thing I should do. It's part of what I am as a human being. I've got to give of myself. Volunteering. And, if we use our courage to maximise our money, that's a shocking thing, isn't it? But if we use our courage to remedy some of the injustices around us, then that's noble. Let's take this further. I'm an English teacher by background. Don't you love that quote from Mr. Darcy? I have been selfish in practice, but not in principle. Can we all say that sometimes? We all think it's a bad thing to be selfish, but at times we find that we've acted very selfishly. And that's the character gap, if that makes sense. And there's a German philosopher called Joseph Pieper. And when I was talking about him, and I gave a talk to some students last year in Melbourne Uni, and one of the guys straight away said, "Oh, I know him, Justin Bieber." Joseph Pieper sort of lived 50 years ago, right? But look at this. This should worry us. He says it's easy to know when somebody is impulsive because they can't control their temper or whatever. It's easy to know when they're timid, but if a person is self-centred, it's a very much harder thing to pick, because on the surface everything looks good, and we need to question ourselves. Am I really going to live for others when I have a family, or am I going to still try and keep corners for myself? A friend of mine in Sydney, a guy's a gynaecologist with 9 kids or something like this. He said, it was only when I had my 3rd child that I realised I couldn't keep corners for myself. Makes you think. Okay, this is part B. To me, I'm going to put some very inspiring figures in front of you. But I'm starting with some words that I found behind a sign in the suburb where I live. So one of the street signs just had a sticker on the back of it, and it just asked the question, what would you die for? It got me thinking. What would you die for? Who would you die for? So let's look. What's Martin Luther King say? The ultimate measure of man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands when it's difficult. It's easy to do the right thing, when you're wide awake and bright, but when you're jet lagged and tired, you can make mistakes. Tough story, true story, but it worked out well in the end. A friend of mine, he had made the mistake of staying in affectionate contact with a girl that he used to know years ago. And then he used to see her when he went overseas, when he was travelling and he went overseas, and they developed an affair, right? And he came back, and he would try to put it away, but he kept on falling into it. And then he told me the story. He said, I came home, and Australia's a long way away, and it was in Europe, and I came home, I was totally jet lagged. And I got in a massive argument with my wife, and I said, that's it, I'm going. And he goes in and tells his daughter. He rings, first of all, his sister and says, you know your granny flat, can I come and stay there? And then he goes into the daughter's room, and the daughter is so upset she can't even talk to him. And he goes into his son's room and says, Mum and I have decided we're going to break up. And then the boy says to his dad, the boy's about 15, he says to his dad, Dad, you don't take Mum out for dinner anymore. Why not? And he says, you can see that I try. And then the boy says to his father, Dad, try harder. And he walks out and he goes to see his wife and says, I can't do this, I'm staying. All because he'd raised his son at least to talk to him directly, right? Interesting. Okay, let's look at this. Let's see if I can make this work. Sorry. Here we go. You know that picture, don't you? So I always thought that was just a picture that somebody snapped from a hotel room. And it's a guy who's got his shopping bags. We know that those tanks are going into Tiananmen Square. We know it's the day after Tiananmen Square. We know that he would know that people have been killed in the square. But he's there with his shopping bags, and I thought it was just a sort of opportunistic shot, you know, that somebody had taken. Look what happens. See if I can make this happen. I think I can do it. I thought I could do it.
I'm not guaranteeing I can.
Oh, that's not a good sign. That's a bad sign. He did that.
Let's see what happens. Okay, do you know where your PowerPoint?
Okay, try, go to YouTube. We'll pull it up there and put it full screen. Okay, look at this. The sound is not very important. The image obviously is neither. Whoa. Oh. Sorry, it's not on my screen. Okay, see what's happening? So he stands in front of, he goes out and stops them. Very brave. He knows that troops have killed a lot of his countrymen. Doesn't move. Look what happens next. Any Spaniards would appreciate the bullfighting aspect of this. Sorry. And then look what he does. He tries to talk them around. He does his best. He knows he's risking his life. Still got his shopping. He's not going to get stopped, is he? And now look what happens. And these guys arrest him, and he was never seen again. Makes you think, eh? That was an on the moment decision that he needed to stop those tanks. Makes you think. Now I've got to get back to this somehow. Sorry.
So if we do that, do you know where your PowerPoint?
It's on the desktop if it's not there.
那么最近呢，大家看到薄熙来当时在两会期间
Okay, that's that.
谈话中，他谈到了有人在我头上泼脏水，这是薄熙来在当时王立军事件之后对中央最强烈的反击。我们的记者在现场观察，告诉你们外界有没有根据这个秘密。事实上，薄熙来180分钟的整体重庆开的开。
Just shrink it. Okay, we're almost there, guys. Bit further. Good work. There it is. A bit further up. Just try there now.
This one.
That one there. Let's see if we can get her up. Okay. You may or may not have heard of this lady. She's a French philosopher. She's on YouTube. She wrote a book about how we have to risk our lives to help others. She went to the beach. There were 2 children in trouble in the water. She swam out to try to rescue them and she drowned. Makes you think. I mean, it started with a conviction. We have to get our convictions right first. Now, it's a tough story, but there's something very noble about it, isn't there? How can righteousness prevail when there is hardly anyone who will give himself up to undivided to a righteous cause? Sophie Scholl and her brother were the 2 core members with several other young soldiers of what was called the White Rose movement, which you might have heard of. They pamphleted against the Nazis, and they were very clever. They spread their pamphlets right throughout Germany, so everybody from Hitler down wanted, I've got to get these guys. And sure enough, he got them in the end, and he executed her. But if you get a chance to see the movie Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, it's a magnificent movie, and it's almost verbatim from her trial. And you can see the stature of this girl. It's really impressive. There's also books out with her letters to her brother. And the thing that really moved her and her brother was an older Catholic intellectual who had been banned by the Nazis, but they decided they were going to help him in his library. And in the library, they found the book of the Shroud of Turin. And they both wrote about it, saying how absolutely mesmerised they were by these images. She was Lutheran. The day that she was to be executed, she asked to become Catholic, and they denied it to her at the time. Look what she wrote. Our budding intellectual development is muffled by a fog of empty phrases, a system of selection to make us godless, impudent, and conscienceless, exploiters and executioners. Wow, she's strong. Isn't that fantastic? Heard of this guy? The most prominent Christian politician in Pakistan. Again, if you Google him, you'll find him talking about how he's had death threats, but he's not going to stop because he needs to speak up for the minorities. And if he loses his life, he said, I will lose my life. But priorities, first things. Look what's happening. It's starting with a conviction that I've got to do this. What convictions do you have? What convictions do I have? We've got to get our convictions right and then work our actions accordingly. What about this girl? Now, I hope I can get this working. You're laughing at me. I'm going to go straight to YouTube on this one. Whoa.
I'm here for other children. I'm here because I care. I'm here because children everywhere are suffering, and because 40,000 people die each day from hunger. I'm here because those people are mostly children. We have got to understand that the poor are all around us and we're ignoring them. We have got to understand that these deaths are preventable. We have got to understand that people in third world countries think and care and smile and cry just like us. We have got to understand that they are us. We are them. My dream is to stop hunger by the year 2000. My dream is to give the poor a chance. My dream is to save the 40,000 people who die each day. My dream can and will come true if we all look into the future and see the light that shines there.
I'm sorry, I'll need your hand.
A 23-year-old American.
Thank you. No, just shrink it and we'll go back to the slides. Thank you. Rachel Corrie, that was her as a 10-year-old. Here she is 23. As a 10-year-old, we're probably fortunate to have that little snippet, right? Because it shows, real passion to help people. She didn't lose that passion. So she was raised with that passion. So there's another lesson there for all of you, right? When you have little kids around your ankles, that you raise them with a passion to help people. We've changed justice from measuring every one of our actions by how it affects others, we've changed that into something materialistic where we just think it's about paying taxes. Every single one of our actions has to serve others. Otherwise, we're shortchanging ourselves because we're not loving. This is big. When she was 23, she went to Palestine in her summer from uni, and she lived with a Palestinian family, and she stood in front of bulldozers that were knocking down their home, and she tripped and the bulldozer went over her. Makes you think. You know, convictions can come at a cost. But are you seeing a big pattern here? What about this guy? This was the first graduate of Redfield College. He died when he was 10. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Everybody's been praying for this guy for a year. Overnight vigils of prayer and everything, right? And maybe in your own families you might have had similar experiences and difficulties, right? But his father explains in his eulogy at his funeral, he says, 2 weeks before Daniel died, I went into his room and he asked me a question. He said, Dad, who was that prophet that took his son up the mountain? And his father's thinking, oh, you mean Abraham? Daniel, do you mean Abraham taking Isaac up the mountain? And then he said to his father, Dad, if God asked you to do that, what would you say? And then Dib explains in the eulogy, the father, well, I told Daniel that I didn't think God would ask me to do that, but he has asked me to do that, and he's given us something greater. He's given us Daniel in heaven praying for us. I use it as an example to show that when this little guy was 2 weeks from dying, he was thinking more of his father than himself. And makes you think. Within a few years, the parents on Daniel's birthday had another boy who looked exactly like Daniel. And a whole series of other things have happened that are quite extraordinary. This movie's coming out. It's about a guy who, when Austria was taken by the Nazis in 1936, I think, he said to the Nazis, I'm not carrying your guns. I'm not going to fight your war for you. You're doing the wrong thing. I've seen what you do. He was a farmer, had 3 little kids, and they put him on trial, and there's a movie about his life. The good news is that in 2008, he was beatified by Pope Benedict, and his 90-year-old wife and his 3 daughters were at the beatification. Makes you think. And this is an Englishman. This is the bravest man I've ever met. This guy's name is James Maudsley. James Maudsley went 3 times into Burma when it was run by a military junta, and his purpose was to bring international attention to what was happening in Burma, because he, as a backpacker, he had been in a refugee camp which had been attacked by Burmese troops, and people had been killed and raped, and it was just shocking. And he said, the world's got to know about this. So he went back 3 times. He got sentenced to 17 years in prison in the end. But because there was so much international attention on it, and he did it very deliberately, they let him go after a year. They put him on a plane and said, get out of here. We don't want you. Since then, he's become a Catholic priest. It's amazing. He ran for Parliament in England, and now he's a Catholic priest. Or, again, I'm going to try and show a snippet here. This won't work very well. These did work before, I promise. Hey. Oh, how do we bring it up? Okay. And I need to bring it across to 2 minutes 50. We're getting closer. We had sound.
So if I do that, which one was it? This one.
2 minutes 50. 50. 50.
50.
Before you play it, I'm going to...
If you want to speak,
Okay.
I'll try and get it on there.
Okay, so the lady that I'm going to show you now, she is an abortion survivor. You can see that she's slightly affected with cerebral palsy. When Victoria passed its horrendous abortion legislation in 2008, she came out and she spoke to the Victorian parliamentarians. And I'm just going to play a little snippet out of it, but it's one of the most powerful speeches I've ever seen. I didn't see it in live. But again, there's nothing in it for her. She herself is a little bit incapacitated, but she's passionate. And it helps us to ask the question, what am I passionate about? Am I passionate to put my best at the service of others? Here we go.
Abortion. Ha! They didn't win. I've done some research on the men that performed the abortion on me. And his clinics are the largest chain of clinics in the United States of America, and they gross $70 million a year. I read him say, I read a quote from him.
My mistake, 5:20.
At some point, several years ago.
We're going to zip forward.
I have aborted over 1 million babies, and I consider it my... Didn't win over me.
Thank you.
And my mission, ladies and gentlemen, among many things, is this. To infuse humanity into a debate that we have just compartmentalized and set on a shelf and said it is an issue. We have removed our emotions. We are becoming harder. Do you really want that? How much are you willing to take and how much are you willing to risk to speak the truth in love and graciousness and stand up and at least be willing to be hated? Or at the end of the day, is it all about you? Or me?
Okay. I really recommend that you try to pull that up and look at the whole thing. It's really extraordinary. I don't think I've ever seen a more powerful speech. And there's another section where she just says, "And men, I would like to address myself to you." And then she really takes it home to the men. It's very impressive. Can we play it? We'll have to keep going. We're going to run out. I know it's tough. I apologise. Luke's an Aussie. Aussies speak straight. What about this guy? This is famous, isn't it? Now, up until now, practically everyone's died. But now I'm going to put a few in front of you that didn't die. This guy survived the war. He made it very clear that he was going to fold his arms when everyone else was saluting Adolf Hitler. And he ended up being elected the mayor of his town, right? So it didn't get him into the disaster that you could expect. Or another guy, a guy that I admire very much. This was the soldier who again survived the war and ended up dying in his 90s. He ended up as an Australian ambassador somewhere and everything, right? But this guy was the soldier most responsible for stopping the Japanese advance over the mountains of New Guinea when they were about to attack Australia. And he was raced back from the Middle East. He was a professional soldier. The soldiers trying to stop the Japanese at that time were just militia. He came up, he organised them, and he staged a withdrawal so that they sapped the energy of the Japanese. But look at the commendation that he got. And this tells us a lot about the virtue that we need to acquire. At all occasions, he led his men with courage, cheerfulness, calmness and skill. How do you remain cheerful when somebody's firing at you? It's amazing, right? Anyway, he showed with his deeds. And this is the guy that took that photo. Again, a very famous Australian, a guy called Damien Pera, who won Australia's first Academy Award. But his policy as a combat photographer was to take the faces of the troops when they were in battle. which means you have to be in front of the guys who are firing. And he did that because he wanted everybody back home to know what these guys are going through. Again, extremely brave. People living up to their convictions. I'm going to show you a slide now of a guy who's probably changed the history of the world and practically nobody's heard of him. He's a guy called Jan Tiranovsky, who was a young tailor who decided that he was going to organise a group for teenagers in his parish that was a prayer group. And there were 2 people in that prayer group that later on became priests. And one of them said that neither Carol nor I would have become priests if it wasn't for this guy. And of course, we're talking about Karol Wojtyla. This guy died very soon after Karol Wojtyla was actually ordained a priest. In fact, he was in hospital dying. And he said, I'm offering all of my sufferings for Carol. Makes you think. And look what St. John Paul said about him. This is a big, deep truth about human love. This is not just a religious truth in a sense, right? He was one of those unknown saints, hidden amid the others like a marvellous light at the bottom of life. He disclosed to me the riches of his inner life. So a guy who's unknown has changed the history of the world. We don't know the effect of our actions on others down the track. Again, other relatively unknown people. These 2 doctors, husband and wife, they went to Ethiopia very idealistically. I think in the 1950s, they're still, the wife is there 60 years later. She's still alive. They set up hospitals that have served thousands and thousands and thousands of women who were outcasts in the society because of the medical condition that they had. Look what she says in this quote. We were touched and appalled by the sadness of our first fistula patient, a beautiful young woman in urine-soaked, ragged clothes, sitting in our outpatients department, away from the other waiting patients. We knew she was more in need than any of the others. They were moved very much with compassion for the needs of these people, and then they threw their lives into it. Look what she says. I'm doing what I love doing. It's not a hardship for me to be doing this. That's what virtue is. In the end, virtue is about loving the actions that we're carrying out that are very noble actions. But somehow we've schooled ourselves, we've conditioned ourselves through our choices, and we end up loving the stuff that we're doing. And that's why a woman can say, I live for my family, as I've heard grandmothers say sometimes. It's beautiful. And the last slides I want to show you, and this will take a couple of minutes and then I think we're on track. But I wanted to put in front of you, again, another hero of mine, a guy called Takashi Nagai, who was under the bomb when it went off in Nagasaki. He was about 800 metres from the epicenter. His wife was vaporised in the bomb. He was in a concrete building working as a researcher. He already had an international reputation, but in the 7 years that he lived after the bomb, he wrote 20 books that probably more than anything else helped Japan overcome the great trauma of the war without bitterness, because he was not bitter. He's an extraordinary guy, and I recommend that you get hold of a book called Song for Nagasaki at some stage. That's him. He had 2 little children that he was raising because his wife had already died. His wife was from one of the old Catholic families of Japan, and he became a Catholic probably at the time of their marriage, I think. That's the only photograph of him in the wasteland that was Nagasaki after the bomb. That's actually him. Extraordinary man. The next 7 years, most of the time he spent lying on his back writing books because he was virtually incapacitated. But he lived in that hut for those 7 years, and he christened the hut Love Your Neighbour as Yourself, which is a good lesson, isn't it? I mean, in terms of not being bitter. But look what he said. He said, being pure in spirit and pure in heart might not win you a lot of money. Remember the 3 P's. But it will give you something even more precious, peace of heart. So what's peace of heart? I want you to think about this. What does it mean to have peace of heart? Because we all want peace of heart. And I think it's something like this, that our desires, our emotional impulses, our convictions, our behaviour and our faith are all aligned. That we haven't got our emotions pulling us in one way and our convictions pulling us in the other, and we're always fighting this internal battle. You know, when there's no longer a character gap and we've acquired virtue in its full degree, our desires and our convictions and our faith and our behaviours are all going in the same direction. And you can see that peace of heart in his life. And it doesn't get tougher than he had to experience. He went and collected the bones of his wife. It's really amazing, right? What people have to go through. This is not about, ultimately, what we've been talking about here is not about giving our lives, as in physically giving our lives. You know, that won't be asked of many of us, but what will be asked of every one of us if we want to love is that we give of ourselves completely with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength in loving others, and only if we can love others will we love God. Or we can choose to be selfish. As Jana Jessen said, is it all about you or me? We've got to think it through. So remember, if we manage our impulses and our fears, we can make rational choices, but we can't use our rationality and our courage for self-aggrandisement or self-indulgence. If we do, we completely stymie the whole purpose of our existence, which is to discover love. And you can't love without sacrifice. Our fortitude, our courage has to be at the service of others. It can't be at the service of ourselves. That would be a tragedy. So think about this. What will you use your courage for? So put your game face on. It's big, isn't it? Remember, fake it till you make it. All right? Fake it till you make it. And remember, it's not the 3 P's, it's the 4 P's because you have to pat your cat. So think about what we've covered. We've covered a lot of ground. I've put a lot of faces in front of you. But please try to lock in 1 or 2 takeaways from what we've been doing now. And make them takeaways that become, in some sense, resolutions for your own life. I encourage you to do this. Thanks very much.